Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Annan Barrett, and I teach in the Textile Arts program at Portland State. For those of you joining us from outside the university, the Textile Arts curriculum is an elective track in the BFA Art Practice program that provides an interdisciplinary approach to the study of clothing and textiles. We offer courses in weaving, surface design, sewn construction, and dress history that encourage students to develop portfolios for a variety of applications in apparel, costume, textiles, and contemporary art. Beginning in fall 2024, we will offer a sustainable fashion minor. This is one of several free public events we are hosting this term, where we bring in outside perspectives to supplement our current course offerings. Please see the links in the chat for psutextilearts.com for information about our programming. I'm going to turn this over now to Shelley Sokolowski, who teaches our weaving pattern and structure course, and she will introduce our speaker tonight, Hope Wang.
Thank you, everybody. So welcome. It's great to see everyone. I'm Shelley Sokolowski, as Annan said, and I teach the weaving pattern and structure course currently, and in the spring, I'll be teaching the digital weaving course. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are joining you all from Portland State University, which is located near the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon in Multnomah County. We honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Today, we are so thrilled to welcome Hope Wang. Hope Wang is an artist and creative entrepreneur based in Chicago, Illinois. She is the founder and founding director of Loom Room, a communal weaving space working to broaden accessibility to weaving equipment for fiber artists in the Chicago area. Wang was also a founding organizer of Chicago Textile Week in 2019 and 2021, an expansive exposition of events and exhibitions connecting and strengthening the textile communities throughout the city of Chicago. In her studio, her artwork explores memory, loss, and longing in the ever-shifting architectural landscape. Her practice encompasses painting, prints, photo collages, and textiles. Wang received her BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2021, was a recipient of the Art Accelerator Grant, and most recently, she was awarded the Visual Arts Fellowship from the Lumen Arts Cultural Foundation, Union League of Chicago, as well as the Breakout Foundation's Chicago Community Fellowship Fund. I am so excited to have you with us tonight, Wang, and I will turn my mute off. And please, before, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to be following along, and at the end of Hope's talk, we will address all of those questions that are there in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for the wonderful introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started with my presentation. And then, yeah. Right. So I just want to begin the talk by thanking everyone for holding space for me to share my practice with you today. What you're seeing here is just a video of the day in the life of my current studio. As Shelley mentioned, I'm an artist and creative entrepreneur based in Chicago, where I graduated from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago with an emphasis in fiber and material studies in 2018. It was there where I fell in love with hand weaving on the floor loom, as well as the digital jacquard loom. When I graduated, I faced what many people ask as they exit institutions with infrastructure around complex and expensive equipment. What next? So I was not in a place to purchase major equipment or even rent studio space required to house the equipment back when I first graduated. So at the time, Chicago also did not have a community textile studio designated for artists to work and connect. So immediately after graduating, I took a year off from thinking about or talking about art to recover from the trauma of art school. Even though my focus in school was on the woven textile art practice, I ended up shifting into printmaking at a community print shop for the first few years after school because it felt like the most accessible way to continue art making when weaving on floor looms and jacquard looms wasn't readily available to me. So ever since 2019, I've been building a studio practice outside of the institution and its resources. So I like to say that simply my work is about being sad in public space, laughing in public space, standing still, looking longer at the details of the urban landscape. And when I say urban, I really just mean it's about the traces of a lot of people converging in the same space at different points in time. I started by photographing most of these things: potholes growing larger in the asphalt, construction zones glittering with neon traffic cones, caution tape tangled around a pole, road signs that get graffitied over, and buildings that are falling apart or being reconstructed. I then reference these photographs in my work. For example, this piece that you're seeing on the right of the screen is a digital weaving where I wove multiple photographic files of tangled caution tape into this woven collage. So in opening up several different images of the tape, I would open it up at different points in time. So like 1 or 2 inches, weave, and then open up another file. So in making this woven collage, I was also mimicking the chaos of this tape out in the world. For me, the entry point is almost always humor. I see these objects used to shape human movement as themselves personified. So these 2 cones are holding hands and they're stretched to the point where the poles are barely holding together. And then I translate it into this wood and ceramic sculpture, thinking about the ways in which some of these tools, when not out in the world creating arbitrary boundaries, are no longer immediately recognizable or functional. And this is a painting based off of different road signs and object markers. I printed out the patterns laid into strips of paper and then made a paper weaving and then translated the composition of that paper weaving into a painting. So while this is a painting, I still look to the architectural landscape and textiles as a reference point for making work that emphasizes pattern, repetitive activity, and often invisible labor. So what you're seeing here are examples of ADA tiles out in space. So they're often used as signs for those who are visually impaired to feel the texture of the ground change, to signal a change in surface. They're often used by platforms on the train or on sidewalks as the curb meets the road. And I started to think about these patterns just as like these fun kind of moments that I'd see in everyday life, and how each, based on the different branding or the source or even the color, the patterns would also be different, and also the ways in which the amount of foot traffic would also transform or wear away at these surfaces that we see all the time. And so I ended up taking this texture and wanting to find a way to incorporate it into my work. So what I did was use paper clay and roll them onto the plates that I found out on the sidewalk or the platform. And I created clay impressions of these patterns and used them as embossing plates for screen prints. So I screen printed these blue, yellow, red paperworks, and then hand embossed all of the little dots and circles and other patterns like around them into the paper. For me, these are like, again, humorous moments in which we are also mimicking surfaces found in everyday life, but also recontextualizing them in different materials. So this is a sample of the same pattern that I drew based on those tiles, and then translated it into a digital weaving file for the digital loom. And then here I've included an image of that file then woven on the digital loom. So to me, part of the fun of making art is the inexhaustibility of what's possible. As you've seen so far, I blend painting, photography, sculpture, print, and a social practice within my body of work. I believe in iterating across multiple processes and materials that overlap and inform each other, rather than being eclipsed by whatever's the most recent or popular kind of work that I've made. I love having this growing toolbox of things that operate as different languages for making. And I mean, part of it is also the practicality of having to reconcile different access points to facilities and tools throughout an artistic career. Sometimes it's just about, this is the tool or the material that I have at hand, and I'm going to use the same idea and make it in that form. And I find that to be kind of a fun challenge and constraint of being a contemporary artist. So for those who aren't super familiar with the digital weaving process, I included this quick video of me transforming an image that I distilled into grayscale layers and basically overlaying the different layers with patterns and textures that will then be translatable onto the loom. So as I'm zooming in closer, you can see that there are weave structures. The binary of black and white are going to map to every single thread on this digital loom. So you can kind of think of every pixel maps to every single thread. And this is how I'm able to translate the digital image into a weavable file. So again, I've also mentioned that a lot of my work is about translation, of taking references out in daily life and bringing that into the studio and making work that kind of transforms from that reference point into a different kind of function. So this is an image that I photographed in a neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I'm originally from. So this neighborhood historically has been disinvested in over the decades, to the point where a lot of the buildings were slated for demolition or no longer safe to exist in. As you can see here, all of the windows are boarded up and so are the doors, but there was an urban beautification mural group that went through and actually painted the first floor of the barricaded laminate wood and made it colorful and seemingly like it was occupied. And if you go through this neighborhood, actually a lot of the buildings are unoccupied, they're vacant, they're unsafe to exist in, but they, from a distance, appear like they have curtains and flowers and these beautiful stained glass doors. And I'm really interested in this kind of moment of like visual illusion of occupancy and how that kind of obfuscates the immediate understanding of the conditions that lead to some of these situations that happen across cities in the US when it comes to disinvestment and then to the physical blight in neighborhoods. And it's really just through the active paying attention, again, of looking closer, looking longer, where I'm interested in sort of translating some of these moments that are often sometimes unsettling and also provisional, and making them in forms that are not so provisional. Hand weaving is a process that is very time consuming, and so is the design process of making digital files appear like they can make yarns look like a different material, like wood or spray paint. So I think this practice of translating some of these provisional laminate wood paintings that other people are doing in public space, and then weaving them line by line in these hand weavings, are also another way of observing the kinds of change that we see within urban space. Part of that observation was also photographing vacant storefronts ever since 2017. I've been collecting images of interesting looking storefronts that are often vacant because of construction, business turnover or various other reasons, and composing them into images that can be woven on the digital loom. In translating these photographs of shorted storefronts, I'm thinking a lot about the pedestrian view as we encounter shuttered spaces. So thinking about those motifs such as blue tape, brown paper, plastic sheets, or spray painted plywood that bar the viewer's access to the realities that exist beyond the surface. And for me, empty storefronts encountered in between life cycles of public facing activity register often as unrelated or irrelevant until there's a store or activity within them. And so in the broader cultural context of the architectural landscape, these vacant storefronts kind of stand as a relic of failed architecture, and they're often regarded as without relevant narrative until, again, the plastic comes down. So traversing the line between image and object, making these weavings look like glass reflections or paper, employs the sort of representational technique of, again, the visual illusion to question the viewer's understanding initially of what is material and what they are perceiving. So this is an image of a painted warp on the digital loom. So one of my favorite things, again, is to combine some of these gestural processes of painting or photography and kind of putting them all together onto the digital loom, which allows me to do so. So I hand dyed the individual warp threads on this warp before putting it onto digital loom, and then used these photographs of basically vacant parking lots and use them to sort of intercept as the weft and create the structure and the image as it builds onto this painted warp. So this is the finished example of what we just saw in that previous image, using, again, photographs of vacant parking lots in industrial spaces such as warehouse parking lots or the factory parking lots, and thinking about the sun setting as people's shifts end and people leave and empty out the parking lot. Again, thinking about these spaces that have a lot of physical activity for people, and then that moment when all of that kind of empties out, and that's that provisional space in between all of that activity. So I've been collecting, again, these images also of like the shadows falling onto these empty spaces. So whether it's the light post against a brick wall, inside of a vacant parking lot, or thinking about the shadow of cast iron gates being cast onto the sidewalk or the porch steps. And these like immaterial kinds of boundary objects that often are used to direct people, whether they can go through, around, or outside of spaces, and thinking about the shadow as sort of an arbitrary boundary because it doesn't actually physically bar anyone from anything, and making these provisional immaterial things more materialized through the cloth. So here are some source images of my walks throughout the past few years, gathering some of these images. Some of the funniest moments are the fact that like I can't really edit myself out of these shadows because of the direction in which I'm facing oftentimes. And I kind of started to incorporate that within my work, is that sometimes you might see like this lump that is just me off to the side, or my hands holding the phone up to be able to get the photograph. And again, thinking kind of about that sort of like pedestrian presence within this work. So this was another example of this painted warp that I loaded onto the digital loom and then took photographs of the cast iron gates and chain link fence that cast shadows onto the side of, say, a garage wall, and then using that to sort of become like a foreground and background within the painted warp. So that's kind of a bit about my work in general, but I also, as Shelley mentioned earlier, have worked as a creative entrepreneur and an arts administrator. So in 2019, when I was just trying to figure out where I would access resources outside of the school, it was just kind of clear to me that Chicago did not have a textile-focused studio space that created the infrastructure for equipment access or community connection. And because of this gap, I was on the lookout for ways to get involved with anyone else who might be trying to address that. So I joined the founder of Chicago Textile Week in putting on the first 2 years of events, which was often 1 week-long program of various events that spanned textile design, manufacturing, art, and fashion. It was a cross-disciplinary kind of movement across the city where we were able to visit showrooms, studios, and gallery exhibitions and host panel discussions. It was just like a really great once a year kind of bender in which a lot of people would travel around the city to meet each other and connect. Programmatically, this was also around the time when I felt convicted to start Loom Room, my fledgling weaving project space. So Loom Room is a weaving project space that supports weavers looking for loom access. We hope to broaden opportunities for artists to grow sustainable practices through programs such as rental equipment and workshops. So by sharing these looms with other makers, this was my attempt at addressing the gap between self-funding access to tools and depending on institutional support for artists. Loom Room's mission is to provide equipment and spaces that encourage artists to experiment and expand their research in the discourse of contemporary weaving. Loom Room recently acquired a TC2 digital jacquard loom, and we plan to broaden access to the tool through an open studio model. As you can see on this map, access to this loom is very sparse, and Loom Room is currently one of only 2 places in North America that supports public access to this loom, which is a lot. So ever since school, I personally, along with many other digital weavers I know, probably had access to this particular kind of loom about once a year, if not once every 3 years. And this was, for any kind of creative practice, pretty difficult in terms of like such limited access in order to even continue the work that we were doing. So the way that me and my co-director have designed Loom Room, it's largely informed by my own artistic journey of navigating resources, as well as our own observations of the pitfalls that some arts organizations have when it comes to sustainable support. Needless to say, access and lack of access to tools and community has shaped my practice as a weaver, as well as an arts facilitator. I think a lot about weaving as a connecting force that has always been relational and physical. I think about the fact that this practice is often always passed on to people by being there in the same room, feeling the tension on the loom, dressing the loom, sharing ideas about different yarns. You just had to be there to learn. So I think that I'm always weaving, though the material may not be yarn or the apparatus may not be the loom. Weaving is always happening all the time in my life, whether that's in the studio or through designing resources, through Loom Room, or through different kinds of programming. So that's kind of going to conclude my presentation. And from here, I'm happy to answer any questions that everyone has. Thank you.
Yes, I see in the chat, let's see, Annan's asking, have you found other cityscapes besides Chicago to inspire your work? And I think you had mentioned earlier that somewhere in Ohio, not Cleveland, somewhere you had said, does it need to be a place where you have lived?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes,
question?
I'm sorry. The question is, have you found other cityscapes besides Chicago to inspire your work? And does it need to be a place where you have lived?
Yes, I definitely have. So, for example, one time I had a curator collector come to the studio, and just looking around, she asked if I had family or if I was from Singapore, which was really funny because I'm not from Singapore, but I have a lot of really close friends who are, and I've traveled there a lot. And she just felt like some of the work just reminded her of Singapore, which is really funny because I have taken a lot of reference from Singapore because of just how prolific they are with just using a lot of road signs and traffic and like object markers. They just love putting black and yellow stripes on everything to warn people. And they're like, unlike Chicago, the weather is generally pretty nice, so things aren't getting worn away constantly on the road. So the just like the colorfulness and the crispness of certain things just kind of gave other people a sense of a different place. And I thought that was just really interesting that they were able to call out a space that I have never really mentioned in my work, but have a deep personal connection to. And I don't live there. Again, I don't have family there, so definitely reference a lot of spaces that I often return to, or just happen to travel to, and find ways to connect with the local environment just by, again, observing, oh, this kind of feature in the architectural landscape often means this or that. And so I think for me, noticing things in different spaces across cities helps with even just informing like, oh, what kind of conditions are related? I mean, for example, the place in Ohio, that's not specific to Cincinnati, like some of the narratives and these images are, but we can talk about disinvested neighborhoods in probably any major city in the US.
Well, that does bring me to Allison's question, which is, taking photos is such a quick act. How do you decide which images to use for a time-intensive process like weaving?
Yeah, it's a repetitive act for me. I think, for example, let me go back to some of these earlier slides. Like this, I have probably I have probably 50 to 100 images that look like this, that they're just different pictures of shadows. And I think I will routinely, maybe twice a year, go through a lot of my photographic archives and print them and just glue them into my sketchbook so that I have something that's more referential. And then from there, I kind of just select like what's the most interesting. So there is just like this almost like rapid collection of these images that are really instantaneous and fast. And it's only after I've photographed a lot of them that I'm like, oh, this is something that like is a thing that I'm looking at all the time. And sometimes it may take 2 or 3 years before I realize that I want to do something with it. So it is sort of this cumulative process where I'm like, this subject is really interesting, has been interesting to me for like a extended period of time. From there, I'm going to go through this collection and see if any of these things are particularly interesting to me. So I often pick things that are like, I think more interesting in terms of composition, or like funny. Again, like I think this photograph on the left, for example, has a lot of these squiggles, and I think that they're going to be a little bit more recognizable than certain other patterns of gates. So that's kind of where I curate, I guess.
Hope, can you tell us a little bit about your warp painting? We've done some dyeing in class, and but we haven't done any warp painting, and I'm sure students would be very interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, I absolutely love warp painting. I first learned weaving on a floor loom, and pretty much every weaving that I put on there was double cloth and painted or dyed. So having the opportunity to do that on the digital loom was just so nice as well. Yeah, I think for example, these that I shared, like yeah, these past 3 images, that was a little bit more random. So I had 4 different bundles of warp and then kind of just laid them all out onto a table. It was about 10 yards, and then used various colors that I had selected and kind of arranged a general like color scheme, and went in really randomly and just let it sort of happen on its own. And then when I put onto the loom, it was actually more of a reactive process where I was like, I had other plans for the files that I wanted to use and create on this warp. And then because I was responding to the warp, I was like, actually, this feels more suitable for a completely different image that I would want to use the painted warp to abstract. So it was kind of, you know, what I love about weaving is one of those things is where you, in the process of dressing the loom, it's not really creative. You can plan really heavily and then suddenly your plans can change once you've actually set up all the constraints of the grid and dress the loom. So that was a moment where I was like, I had completely different plans for what I wanted to do with this warp. And then having seen it actually on the loom, I was like, nope, we're gonna completely do something else. And it's more yeah, responsive to what I'm seeing. And I think that's something that I think is really fun about having to get to plan heavily the weaving process, but not also get to spontaneously respond to what I'm seeing as I'm weaving. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about students might not understand the process of painting a warp at all. You know, because we've been doing immersion dyeing with skeins of yarn. So maybe you could explain a little bit about what you're painting with and how you're laying the warp out, and are you using like what kind of dye you're using and that type of thing.
Got it. Thanks for the clarification. So I will wind the warp as one would normally do to set up the loom, and then lay it out onto a table, and then basically keeping the cross sort of lined up. You basically will stretch out the warp as if it is on a loom, so creating that tension on the table, and laying out all the threads as closely as possible as if you would see them on the warp, on the loom. And then from there, using synthetic dyes, at least for this one, like having different pots of the synthetic dyes, and then sort of soaking the yarns in first, like a kind of what's it called, a mordant base, I think, so that the yarns can take the dye a lot better. And then it'll, for overnight, basically 24 hours, letting the dye sort of sit and soak into the yarns. And then from there, washing everything and then winding them onto the loom. And then because of the ways that all of the individual yarns will shift as they get wound onto the loom, there's kind of this ghosted effect that happens, which I love. And so there's different ways to kind of arrange them, but basically if you keep the order of all of the bundles in place, and then basically lay them onto the loom as you're tying in that same order in which you dyed it, that will kind of keep your dyed composition consistent onto the loom. Is that
Great. And how tell us about the set that we're looking at here. So students right now in our class are threaded at like say 10 or 12 ends to the inch. So what are we looking at here? We don't know digital weaving quite yet.
Yeah, so digital weaving. So this particular loom I wove when I was at my residency in Cleveland at the other space that has a digital loom, and their loom has 1,320 threads, which is about, I think it's 30 or 45 ends per inch. So that's very different than 12 or 10. And so you're dealing with like, if you think about your Photoshop file, it's basically 1,320 pixels. And so that's about the like amount of threads that you're working with. And kind of with the editing of the digital file, you're also thinking about an image that has 1,320 pixels, which is for a photographic file a pretty low res file. But for weaving, I think again, like there's ways that there's an opportunity for abstraction, to use the image as sort of a suggestion, and then letting the yarn sort of do its own thing as it fills in these spaces. So you have control of all of these threads as they're laying next to each other, but then also being able to play with like the weft in terms of how it operates on like with the warp, with that as it's like lifting based on the image.
So your those images where you were weaving reproductions of glass, that was pretty amazing. Yeah, like that one. I am assuming that's more than 30 ends to the inch. I don't know. I don't know where you wove this. And if you could explain the set on this particular type of image so students can get their head around the difference between the 30 and the 10 and the.
I mean, so because of this particular series of work, which is much more photographic and much less abstracted than the other works that I'm dealing with, that's actually what led us to get a loom at Loom Room that was at 60 ends per inch. So our loom is 56 inches wide and there's 3,520 threads, because I wanted to be able to work with even more like pixels basically, and higher resolution would mean that we could push the image quality that the loom would be able to produce. On this particular one, I believe the set was, it was probably 45 ends per inch. So, which is pretty decent, but there's definitely some pitfalls when it came to a few certain details that I wanted to make. And sometimes, again, I think the constraint is sort of nice to be able to think about what is essential within the image that I can push the loom to maintain. But I'm definitely very excited to have a loom that has 60 ends per inch so that we can push a lot more of the detail.
So Hope, I'm curious, could you tell us a little bit about how Loom Room is set up? I mean, are you going to be offering residencies like Praxis, or is this like if a student wants to come to Chicago and rent time on the loom, or how does this work?
Yeah, so we're actually opening our booking calendar this spring. So we've been getting a lot of questions about how it works. And hopefully by showing people in a couple months, we'll get to establish that. And we're also kind of figuring that out too. But basically the open studio model is that I didn't really want to do a residency model where people would basically have 2 weeks or a month at a time on the loom. I have done residencies and I loved it. I was at Praxis for 1 month and then also 2 weeks. And when I was there, I wove in a frenzy. I think I wove like maybe 1.5 pieces a day because I was just so hungry and also like desperate to make as much as possible because I wasn't sure when I would next get access to the loom. And as a very able-bodied person, I was like not okay physically after doing that, then which is why I really wanted to think about what kind of studio model would be possible where people could maybe access the digital loom in a more incremental fashion. So with Loom Room, it's more of a pay per use, where we don't have a max cap on the amount of days that you can reserve, but maybe more of a max cap on the yardage just to get enough people in at once. But it really is just kind of about looking at our calendar for the available slots and the available yardage, and we have sort of a default warp on there, and people can then request like, can I book for 5 days and weave up to maybe 3 yards during that period of time? And we are happy to say that. So it's a more of a bespoke like request as the amount of time that you would want to use and the amount of yardage that you can use up to. And that way people can kind of at various financial capabilities figure out like for them what works at that moment in time. So if somebody only has funds or time for a weekend, then we'd love to support that as opposed to asking someone to set aside 2 weeks or a month of their time from away from their job or time to travel to Chicago and pay the cost of all those travel fees in order to make all their work for the next like year or two in one go. Our hope is to be able to have a model where people can come in like once a week or once every month and continuously test out ideas in a more consistent and more incremental fashion so that we can kind of get to be able to see more experimental ideas as opposed to this like fireworks of like, oh, we have to do all of this at once and we have to do like 10 things that are all going to go toward like one show. So that's sort of the way that we're hoping to model access, which is different than the residencies that I've been to when I've been using this loom.
Yeah, that's great. What about the warping? Now, I know that students in my class have had, how should we say this? A surprise awakening. I won't call it a rude awakening, a surprise awakening of what it takes to thread a loom. And you're talking about 10 or 20 yards or more at 3,000. I mean, who's doing that work? Are you doing the work?
Currently, yes, but I mean, it's not possible to do all by yourself, and it would be a very guaranteed journey into burnout to do it all by myself. So actually, one of our things is because our loom is pretty big and our offering is pretty extensive. It also means the cost of overhead and the loom rental is, and even setting up the warp is a lot. So in comparison to other residencies that are available for this loom, we are going to be significantly more expensive if you really like mapped out the same amount of time that you would have on it. And so we really wanted to be able to also test out this idea of a time bank. So like a bartering system of people contributing their labor to help with the warping process and also get to learn, the more ins and outs of setting up this loom so that they feel more comfortable on it because there's such sparse access. People are not going to be learning that on their own. And then also in exchange for their labor to contribute in helping with the warping process, they can earn weaving credit time. So this is our way of being like, if you are willing to help and basically give community investment into this community warp, then in exchange, you can earn time on the loom to weave. So we're hoping that will be a popular kind of test for our time bank model. But yes, that was, I think, getting this loom and realizing that it took almost 5 days straight to put on warp was between 3 people was like, I think that this like forces us to also invite the community in to contribute to the labor of putting on a warp that everyone is going to be using and renting time to access. So that's our
That's cool.
our model to address the very rude awakening of the amount of effort it takes to put on a warp.
That's great. That's really a good idea. Those are great ideas. Yeah, warp party, right, Allison? For sure. So students, you're looking at Hope's digital loom. That's the loom that you're seeing back on the right there in the image. That's like white and very industrial looking, white and turquoise. And PSU has also a digital loom, not as wide as Hope's. It's a little bit narrower, and so there's a little less weaving width, but it's an amazing piece of equipment, wouldn't you say? So how many floor looms do you have there in your space at Loom Room?
So we have 2, and they're both 8 harness, 10 treadle looms. One of them has a sectional warp beam, and the other one has like just a basic roll. And they're pretty different in terms of like looms, which I think is always fun, is how different all of the loom designs are. But my general like thing for when we selected which floor looms to acquire for Loom Room were that they would be big and they'd at least be a minimum of 8 harnesses because those are more expensive and larger. So thinking about what kind of purpose does Loom Room serve? It's usually looms that are big and hard to hold space for or purchase like off the bat. Like a lot of table looms and 4 harness looms are generally pretty affordable. So this was kind of like the prerequisite, I guess, is like things that are gonna be a little bit harder for people to jump the gun and purchase for themselves is something that I would like to put in Loom Room.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So I'm really, in the weaving class, we have graphic designers, as I told you prior to our conversation as a group. We have graphic designers, we have sculpture artists, we have painters, we have a variety of different media. And I'm really interested in the way you are translating from one medium into another and sort of overlapping these these ideas. And I'm hoping that my students are having some takeaways from that. That was really very cool. Does my students, if you want to put any questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask Hope something directly, that would be a wonderful, now's a wonderful time to do that.
I'm also looking in the chat for some other questions. I know there's a question about Chicago Textile Week. And yeah, I might not be able to read more of the chat.
Yes, here we go. Is Chicago Textile Week still happening?
It is not, unfortunately. That was an sort of unfortunate, also rude awakening of realizing that the way that we structured the collaborative approach, which it was all volunteer labor, just wasn't sustainable. We weren't able to kind of agree on a way to make it more sustainable and get people paid or supported or get funding, even though there's a lot of popularity. So we ended up dissolving that, and it just was, I don't know. I mean, putting it on was like a part-time job for a year, and to do that for so many years without enough support was just like not tenable anymore. But Loom Room, we're kind of trying to maybe all the people who did volunteer run a lot of their own textile businesses in Chicago. So a lot of us are thinking more modularly. How can we maybe do things that are a little less concentrated, but a little that can be supported by their own sort of businesses. So like, for example, Loom Room, we are planning something like a weaving weekend in October. So we won't be collaborating necessarily with like a week-long set of events with other people, but trying to do something that maybe is to scale of what me and my people at Loom Room can offer, rather than it being like all completely like volunteer work, and having to collaborate across like multiple organizations. So hopefully we're gonna have something that's more of a that is gathering people in Chicago, but it's not gonna look like Chicago Textile Week anymore.
Right. And on your pieces, how do you decide whether to finish the hem or leave the unwoven warps to show? I noticed also that you have some threads that are off to the side, sometimes that are, how do you make those choices?
So I think I sometimes just get bored and I want to try something new. And then I really haven't figured out like my go-to setup. A lot of the choices are on just how to make things easier to install. I think some people who are not textile artists, like certain galleries and curators, get nervous. So I wanted to create ways that would make it really easy to ship and send out to people who don't know how to handle it all and keep the work safe. So for example, a lot of works I have a preference to actually sew Velcro onto the top, and then use like a wooden bar that's often like painted to match the weaving, and then I put like Velcro on the top so that I can ship, so that they can actually just like screw the bar into the wall with an easy like level situation, and then the piece at the top just gets Velcroed onto the top. So it's really easy to handle and very easy to install. And then there's some that are framed, which is the easiest thing to install and I love. And it also keeps the work a little bit more protected, and I think people really love that. But then I also know people love fringe because it makes it feel extra tactile. So I think it kind of really, I respond to maybe the concept as well. For example, the window weavings, they feel fitting that they're more like they're actually framed as if they're almost like in a window. And then some of the larger ones that have like a fringe like hanging down below, it's fun because in person they actually like they're really thin, and like if there's like any kind of draft in the space, they'll start to like move. So I feel like the long fringe really fits that, especially with like the shadows. So it kind of, I like to respond a lot to like, oh, does this fit? And also, is this piece a really dense piece? Because then it feels like that will also kind of inform the way that the work sits on the wall or mounted or things like that. So I've been trying a lot of different finishing techniques. I haven't figured out which one's my favorite, but I like to kind of change it up just for my own like boredom.
Yes, I think I saw one on Instagram where it was, I think, the one where the shadow, it was shadows and it was off to the side, and then there was the air current, it was blowing it was just gorgeous, and you could just feel, I mean, just having it move like that, you could just feel the life of the textile itself.
Yeah, I can't really imagine that piece like not having that long fringe or being framed. So yeah, it just that one felt like, okay, that makes sense.
That's right.
I see a question in the chat about the logistics of making the TC2 and weaving in general publicly accessible. I recently had a meeting with one of our upcoming renters who's coming in March, and they were like, was it hard? And I was like, specifically which part? And they're like, on any part. The purchase, the raising the funds, the setting up of the business, the warping. I'm like, all of it's really hard. I mean, a lot of people do have the TC2 in their private studios, and that makes a lot of sense to me. You don't have to coordinate people coming in to use the tool, to know how to use it correctly, to not possibly damage it. It's an expensive thing to set up, even just with the electrical and the space required for it. It is, I would say that like making something like community-based is going to be difficult because you have people dealing, like a lot of different people coming in to use it.
So how will you manage that? That's a good question. That's a good thing to discuss, because how will you manage that? Will you be there all the time to sort of oversee? Will there somebody be there when there's a glitch or something before? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was studying at SCIC and learning on the tool, it was often that the teacher would teach in the class, and then students would sign up for a weaving calendar that everyone would kind of respect, like 8-hour slots at a time within every 2 weeks. And that I felt like was I liked that kind of, again, like sort of open studio model where you sign up for like short slots at a time. But the pitfalls of that was that a lot of students wove outside of like class hours. So there was no supervision, not even like the studio staff. And there were a lot of kind of issues like broken threads getting really tangled. And then the next week we're having to deal with the problems or the loom being down. So I think from that experience, I was like, if I ever get a TC2 in a studio, I will always be there. I will be monitoring, and we will have like a check-in and close out at the end of each shift so that all threads are fixed. And like any tangles or any issues are noted immediately, and like I'm there to support so that if anyone gets really nervous about the tool, that they can immediately ask somebody without it being just encroaching on someone's time or it being sort of an unpaid situation. So that's definitely like, I don't know, I was like, I think that like having access to help is really conducive to everyone having a better time on this tool. Even though that kind of limits the amount of time that someone can weave at once, I think that that's okay. So yeah, all of our weaving sessions will be monitored by me or by my co-director. And hopefully like most people who we accept for the rentals are people who need to have prior access or authorization. So we're actually through these authorizations going to be going through best practices for fixing threads, best practices for making sure your file like makes sense, and general like studio setup, just to get people comfortable and confident to be in here. So one of the things that I observed was that it was just a lack of confidence with the tool because they weren't, at least at school, we weren't allowed to touch anything besides like open pattern and weave. So people didn't know how to cut off, people didn't know how to adjust the tension. And if anything came up, it was just like, oh my gosh, I'm scared and I don't want to touch anything. or I don't know how this works. And so part of the hope with these authorizations is that we cover all of that, and that there's always going to be staff available to, you know, troubleshoot anything that isn't like immediately fixable. And then also having some of these like warp changeovers together, people will sort of better understand how this loom works, so it's less scary for everybody.
That makes a lot of sense. What, one question about your work, what weft materials are you working with? I know the warp is probably cotton, maybe it's not cotton. Can you explain a little bit about your material choices and the materiality that we've seen there?
Yeah, so I really love 220 wool. It's just gorgeous, and unfortunately it also means because of that like really thin lace weight material, then it takes a lot longer to do anything. But it just, I really like the sort of like detail that I can get in with that wool. And then I like to mix wool and cotton. So, you know, it is often cotton warp and then wool weft to sort of play with the like light playing off, like bouncing off of the cotton. So the cotton's always mercerized, and so that's extra shiny, where often the wool is really matte. And so I really enjoy like being able to walk around the textile and seeing it shift, because the light is playing off of it differently from different angles. And I don't know, that's what I love about weaving, is that in textiles at least, is that you have to see them in person. Like sure, in a digital image, a well photographed digital image is great, but you don't see that light shifting, or yeah, the wind blowing on the fringe, or even just getting to see the like material look different from different angles. So I would say that yeah, it's often like a cotton warp and then wool weft. Or I really like to, I've really been into like bamboo. Again, it's very shiny and it's super soft. So like using bamboo has been really fun. And then I've had moments where I'm willing to splurge a little bit more, and I've used like a paper linen, which is super cool. And that linen holds like the memory of it being like scrunched or move about. So that's been a little bit more dimensional for some works. And I think that like, yeah, again, being able to play with light and the dimensionality of the weft materials is really fun for me. My co-director would love to be able to introduce more silk, which of course is like super expensive. So one of his ideas is to like maybe get donations, or like donate like a cone or two of silk one here and there, and let people sort of play around and sample with it. But yeah, the idea of making one whole weaving out of silk would be gorgeous, and probably will take me to save some saving up for that.
That's for sure. I'm really enjoying looking at the blue piece that's just right behind you there, and how the weft is like coming out of the edges like that. That's because it's really restrained and bound in the central portion of it, and then the edges are sort of releasing that binding.
Yeah, I think I was like, the first time that I tested it, I was really into the fringe being like really a lot more played up than I usually do on my other pieces. And mostly because it was like the pattern with it inside is like super controlled. And so it's also like a deflected double weave. So for those who don't know, it's like the warp is split into two cloths that are woven simultaneously, but then like these white sections are actually when the weft will interlace between the two separate cloths to stitch them together. And so I felt like wool made a lot of sense with the cotton, so I'm gonna be wet finishing it and hopefully felting some of the spots in various areas and seeing how the piece continues to shift, just based on how like wool and cotton respond differently to water.
Ooh, that's cool. Felting some of that. I know we have a felter in the class, so I hope she heard that.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I did a little test, and the shrink rate was pretty intense, but we'll see how that goes.
Good. Well, it's 7. Does anyone else have any questions for Hope while we have her? Maybe we can stop sharing your screen now, Hope, and come back to the group. Yes, that would be great. I might have missed some of the chat. I had that a teeny little section on my screen where I was looking at the chat, and I can see that there's some people harping in now. So yes, it's really beautiful work, Hope. Thank you so much. And I can see Lorena over there weaving.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hope. This has been fascinating to look deeper into your process. Thanks for sharing so much about it.
Thank you all for asking so many questions and yeah, tuning in.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks, Sierra, for being here. Yeah, it's pretty beautiful work. All right, everyone. Well, I think that's going to conclude our evening with Hope. Yes, great. So PSU, there's Annan put a link there in the chat so we can revisit this talk with Hope and any of the other lectures that we've had for the last few years that are posted there in the Textile Arts Events area on our website. It's great.